Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book and DeKalb County Public Library, welcome to our new series of virtual events. Due, of course, to the global pandemic that we all are living through right now, our public events have ceased as of March, simply because our libraries aren't open, and we're all sort of staying at home and trying to stay safe. But we decided to go ahead and move our events from our auditorium to an online platform to continue bringing you those wonderful author programs that we have for years and highlight the works of not only best-selling authors, but our Georgia authors right here at home. I would like to thank the DeKalb Library Foundation. They are the fundraising arm of our library system that ensure that we have the funds that are not covered by the tax digest for things like our Take the Internet Home program, our 1,000 Books Before Kindergarten. They also provide many of the supplies that we use for our summer reading programs for all of our library branches. And they are the entity that purchased the Zoom account to allow us to come into your homes this evening. So we would like to thank our sponsors, the DeKalb Library Foundation, for our event tonight. Just a few reminders that if you would like to ask a question, you can either type it into the chat box and I will read it aloud to the room, or you can feel free to use the raise your hand feature and Allie, our assistant, will recognize you and you can feel free to ask the question yourself after our presentation this evening. So right now, I would like, of course, to turn this over to William Rawlings. He has been on our stage many times before, and he has actually helped the DeKalb Library Foundation before by being the guest at one of our fundraising galas. He is here tonight to talk to you about a new book from Mercer University Press, 6 Inches Deeper, The Disappearance of Hellen Hanks, and it's a true life Georgia mystery that takes place in Valdosta, Georgia. William, of course, is well known for a mystery series of novels, as well as some nonfiction work that he's done about Georgia history. So thank you all for coming this evening, and will you please join me to welcome William Rawlings.
Thank you, Joe. Am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Good, good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I've been looking forward to this. Tonight we're going to discuss my most recent book, 6 Inches Deeper, which came out around the 1st of March. It's a bit of a change for me. It's a true crime book. I've never done true crime before. And if you're a emerging writer, as they say, or if you're someone who wants to be a writer, one of the adages that they tell you is you should never jump genres. Well, I have. I started off writing suspense fiction set in the non-urban, not rural, non-urban South, please. After that, I became fascinated with Georgia history, and I started writing a few magazine articles, and those morphed into 3 books on the work of Georgia history. Last year, in 2019, I had a book released titled The Girl with Kaleidoscope Eyes, which was, again, suspense fiction, set in Savannah that time. But then this year, my book is 6 Inches Deeper, which is really something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. It is a fascinating tale. It's a type of writing that I hadn't done before and actually required me to change my style a little bit to sort of fit the genre. Briefly speaking, this is about a murder that took place in Valdosta, Georgia in 1972. And the case dragged on for a number of years. In fact, the last official act on this case was in June of 2017. So you have a period of really over 45 years. The sort of tagline of the book is this. On August 31st, 1972, a pretty 34-year-old mother of 3 named Hellen Hanks disappeared from her place of employment. She worked at Wilcox Advertising. And the story was that she was at work. Her boss, a fellow named Foxy Wilcox, a former attorney who went into a businessman running an outdoor advertising business, and his son, Keller Wilcox, had been in Atlanta on business that day. They returned late in the afternoon to find the lights in the office were open, the radio was playing. Hellen Hanks' car was parked outside with the key in the ignition, and yet she was gone. They waited for a while, and they couldn't, nothing happened. They made some phone calls. Nobody knew where she was. They called the police, they called her husband, and in essence, she simply disappeared. The local police made a fairly perfunctory investigation initially. In fact, the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was called in later and investigated, but no clue as to the missing woman's whereabouts was found. The police theorized that she had, quote, run off with another man, end quote, but there was really no evidence of that. And if having gotten to know Hellen Hanks' family and having looked at the circumstances in detail, she was not the sort of person to run off with another man. That was really pretty ridiculous. So in essence, the case went cold. And time went on. Nothing happened until 8 years and 3 months later, in November 1980, two farmers clearing some land south of Valdosta, using what's called a chisel plow, or as we say in the South, a root rake, scraped into something underground. And lo and behold, they looked in the hole, and it turned out to be a box, and the box turned out to contain the dismembered remains of the missing woman, Hellen Hanks. This again was in November of 1980. After a several-month investigation, the police arrested 4 people. They arrested Ms. Hanks' employer, Foxy Wilcox, his son, Keller, plus 2 African-American employees that worked for the business. And they were, Keller was charged with murder. The other were charged with accessory after the fact and concealing a death, basically. Again, this was in July 1981. The case eventually came to trial the next year in January of 1982. Now, the question is, what's so interesting to me about this? Some of you who know me know that I have practiced medicine for years. I'm retired now, but for years I was a doctor. I still am, I guess. And I would come to work every morning, and sort of the pleasure of coming to work was getting a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper back in the days when we actually had newspapers. And this case in 1982, the trial in January 1982, was just absolutely fascinating. And I had a bad habit back then when newspapers were actually paper things that you could touch, feel, you know. I would tear out interesting articles and put them in a drawer. And after about once a year, I would have this big stack of interesting things in the drawer, and I would take it out, read them, and throw them all away. Well, at the end of the year, I remember seeing, gosh, I've got a lot of clippings from this particular case, and I'm just really fascinated by it. In fact, I've thought about it all over these 3+ decades. And so when the opportunity arose to do something a little different, I said that I pitched this book to Mercy University Press, and after some discussion and back and forth, they agreed to allow me to write the book, and that's where the case came out. The book has been really phenomenally interesting. This is my 10th book, and I can honestly say that I've gotten more feedback and more positive feedback from this book than I have anything else I've written, which is quite surprising. I didn't expect the extremely positive response I've gotten. The simple fact was that Keller Wilcox was convicted of murder and eventually went to prison, but that's not the story. People say, well, you know what happened. Why did you write this? And it's sort of like the movie. You remember the movie Titanic? I remember someone saying when it was so popular years ago, someone said, well, why do you want to go see the movie? We all know the boat sinks in the end. I mean, what more do you need to know? Well, the thing about writing this book is that it was, number one, a challenge, and number two, it was fascinating. When it comes to writing, whether you're doing fiction or nonfiction, you have to tell a story. For example, my previous books on Georgia history, if I simply gave a litany of dates and said this happened on such and such a date and this happened, people would read about 2 paragraphs and put the book down. But as a writer, your job is to tease out a story. And if it's fiction or nonfiction, you have the same elements. You want a beginning and a middle and an end. You want characters. You want the characters to have a personality. You need conflict. You need a plot of some sort. You need a denouement. You need a resolution. You need what is called, in writing parlance, the arc of the plot, from the beginning to the middle to the end. And if you can find a tale like that, that is nonfiction and you can have the opportunity to write about it, it's great. And that's what I saw in this book. I don't particularly like to do readings, but I do want to read you a quote from the Atlanta Constitution in January of 1982. This is the sort of thing that appealed to me and actually made me want to write this book. And this is again quoted in Atlanta Constitution, January 1982, talking about the trial. It says, quote, "A rich, handsome young married man from a prominent family is on trial here for murder. He's accused of killing his attractive secretary nearly a decade ago, cutting off her legs so her body would fit into a makeshift coffin, then burying her at night with the help of his aging father and two trusted black employees. He's defended by one of the most colorful and respected lawyers in the country. Prosecutors hint at a sexual motive. Defense lawyers say police threatened black witnesses with lynching and damnation to get confessions. The defendant's pretty dark-haired former wife says on the stand that she was hypnotized by lawmen. A deaf and mute friend of the victim testifies that shortly before her disappearance, the woman expressed fear of the man now accused of killing her." Well, you've got about everything you need there for a plot. If it's fiction or nonfiction, you've got money, you've got power, you've got sex, you've got struggle, you've got a deaf mute person who testifies, you've got the police, you've got the subject of race, which actually was important in this case. And so this was a fascinating case. The trial that took place in January 1982 pitted the local prosecutor, a guy named Lamar Cole, against Bobby Lee Cook. Now, those of you that are a little bit older than 25 probably remember Bobby Lee Cook. He's still alive. He was probably one of the South's and probably the nation's premier defense attorneys in the 1980s. He defended, I believe, Wayne Williams at one time, some of his legal run-ins in Atlanta, and he also did one of the trials of Jim Williams in Savannah, which was written up in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Bobby Lee Cook was a colorful fella. I remember he did a case here in Sandersville. He would always arrive in a chauffeured Rolls Royce and was known for his goatee and his pipe. He was a master of the courtroom. And so and he was also very expensive. It was rumored that he charged $500,000 back in the 1980s. I think it was probably an exaggeration, but it was rumored that he charged an exorbitant sum of money. And so you're pitting this really high-priced, nationally known defense attorney against a small-town DA from South Georgia. And the outcome, according to the press, as things got started, was pretty much preordained. It was certainly true that Bobby Lee Cook would get him off because Bobby Lee Cook in his own publicity posted that he had a 90% non-conviction rate for murder trials. And so you think that he would probably get everybody off. Well, the trial lasted about 2 weeks. And the interesting part was that it was totally circumstantial. There was no direct evidence connecting Keller Wilcox and indeed his father to the crime. And yet the two African-American employees, one of whom was quite elderly and the other was not quite so old, gave statements that said that they had observed the body, at least one of them said he had observed the body being dismembered and that they had driven to a certain spot, and the two employees dug the grave while Mr. Wilcox and his son watched, and so forth and so on. And so it was pretty damning testimony, but then they later recanted their testimony and said that the statements they had given were not true. So the trial was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, particularly the courtroom annex. And if you've ever looked at a trial transcript, you have to pretend it's sort of a movie script and read it, and you sort of see the picture in front of your eyes. And this would make a great courtroom drama, simply reporting what was written in the script. But after a nearly 2-week trial, it took the jury, according to what one of the jurors said, about 10 minutes to convict Keller Wilcox of murder. And the other, his father was convicted of concealing the death. The two African-American employees had been given immunity from prosecution, despite the fact that they had recanted their testimony that was beneficial to the state. And so thereafter, Keller went to prison. This was in January 1982. Well, fast forward a little bit. there was a series of appeals, as you might expect. It went through the state court system. And then in 1985, it fell in, after the state appeals had been exhausted, it fell into the federal system. And Judge Wilbur Owens in Macon, he's now deceased, he was the federal judge at the time who handled the case. He took it under advisement, and after a hearing, a series of hearings, he ruled that Keller Wilcox had been wrongly convicted based on an inadequacy of evidence, and perhaps equally importantly, what he perceived to be the violations of civil rights of two of the witnesses, the African-American employees who had testified for the prosecution and later recounted the testimony. It's very complicated. Long story short, in late December 1985, Keller Wilcox was sprung from prison, sent home, and it looked like, by all indications, that he would not be retried. The federal rules hold that you normally do not release a prisoner from incarceration unless there's an almost overwhelming evidence that he would prevail in a second trial, or if a second trial is not possible. But he was released. At that time, there was a fascinating magazine named Southern Magazine. It existed for about 3 years, and in the November 1986 issue, there's a great article by a guy named Dotson called "The Second Life of Keller Wilcox." And Dotson was a former reporter for the Atlanta newspapers. He went down to Valdosta and interviewed everybody, and it looked like he was going to get off completely. Keller maintained his innocence and that he'd been wrongly convicted, although no one else was a suspect at the time. Well, Mike Bowers was the Attorney General at the time, and Mike decided as Attorney General to appeal the case to the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And it didn't take the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals very long to completely overturn Judge Owens' ruling and send Keller Wilcox back to prison. The Court of Appeals was quite harsh in their condemnation of his opinions. And so Keller Wilcox went back to prison. This was 1986. And so there were multiple appeals that went on for years. He stayed in prison. And finally, in 2004, Mike Bowers, who had been the Attorney General and who put Keller Wilcox back in prison in 1986, or as Attorney General, his appeals did, Keller hired him to get him out of prison, which was a 180-degree turn. And so they started a series of aggressive appeals trying to get him released on his charge of murder. He was serving a life sentence, in case I didn't make that clear. This went on for a year or so and nothing happened. And finally, in 2006, Keller, who had adamantly denied everything up to that point, confessed to the crime. Well, at least he sort of confessed to the crime. In fact, his confession really didn't match too much the known facts, but he did do two things. Number one, he expressed remorse and he did admit culpability. And then he was eventually released in the spring of 2008. Part of his release was that he was banned from Brooks and Lowndes counties, which are Quitman, Georgia, and Valdosta, Georgia. And that ban was removed in June of 2017, and he is free to return there. He lives in South Georgia now. That's the story. The interesting thing about writing this book is that a lot of people that I wrote about are still alive. And there were just a flurry of rumors, all sorts of things, some of which were totally ridiculous, some of which were scandalous, and none of which could be confirmed or were confirmed. And so I was faced with, how do you write a book like this? How do you tell this story? And so I adopted what I've been told is a journalistic style. I basically said, this is a true tale, truthfully told. And I went into a tremendous amount of detail to document everything. So in this book, there are lots of opinions and there are lots of suggestions, and there was a lot of controversy because, of course, the defendants denied any guilt and any culpability in Hellen Hanks' death. But the newspaper reports and the magazine reports were such that I could get a lot of information there, and so I used a lot of verbiage quotes from those to sort of give a little bit of color and opinion to the story. The other thing that's a little bit different about this book is that I've sat here and told you about the story, and the one thing that I have not mentioned was Hellen Hanks. Hellen Hanks was the victim, and Hellen Hanks, by all accounts, I feel like having gotten to know her family and having discussed with them her life in detail for a number of months, that she was just a fine, totally decent person. And so I've tried to include a chapter in this book titled The Other Victims, because so often in cases like this, you focus on the court, or you focus on the attorneys, or you focus on the crime, or this or that. But the victims get pushed to one side. And this was a case that was really a horrific case. Helen was the mother of 3 children. Her husband worked as a prison guard. They did not have a lot of financial resources. The plans and hopes of this hardworking young lady for her children really were blown up when she was murdered. Fortunately, through pluck and through good fortune and through the assistance of good friends and neighbors, her 3 children did extremely well now, and they're one of them is deceased, but the other 2 are alive and well and quite successful in what they do, and so that's something to be proud of. But it was a horrible situation for the family, and I also go into some detail with that. As I said, this was a different style for me. I included in the back of the book a timeline, which makes it a little bit easier to understand. And I also included a list of characters. There were, I guess, 50 or 60 witnesses or more at the trial. I tried to get everybody in there. And so it turned out to be pretty good. And as I said, I've gotten very positive feedback. I think the only funny thing about this, funny and I remember strange, was the title, 6 Inches Deeper. And I've gotten some, I was like, 6 inches deeper, what does that mean? The thing that appealed to me most about this whole story was the role of fate. Because, Ms. Hanks was murdered in 1972. The body was found 8 years later, and it just so happened that these 2 farmers were plowing this one field, and their plow went down about 8 or 10 inches in the ground. And if it had been an ordinary plow, it wouldn't have struck anything. But it was the role of fate that caused this whole thing to fall apart. I think that, assuming the jury was correct and that Keller Wilcox was in fact the murderer, I think that, it had gotten so far in the distant past that said, that we've gotten away with it, whatever. And then everything fell apart when the body was discovered. And so that is why I chose the title of 6 Inches Deeper. If the box had only been buried 6 inches deeper, and by the way, that was a quote from testimony at the trial. If the box had only been buried 6 inches deeper, then none of this would have happened. The book would have stopped at the end of chapter 2 or chapter 3, and the rest of the story wouldn't have been written. And to this day, no one would have realized what happened to Hellen Hanks, what was her unfortunate fate, and her family would have lived their lives not knowing what became of their mother. So it's a strange event. It was a pleasure to write. I enjoyed it. As I said, it's a different genre, and I've received requests to write other books in the same genre. I don't know what I'll do next. My next book is coming out next year. It'll be published in March of next year. It's a book on lighthouses of the Georgia coast. It's a little, again, jumping genres again. It's a little different, but it's a fun book to write. So at that point, if anyone has any questions or if I can answer anything, I'd be happy to.
Well, William, thank you so much. While you're on the topic of genre jumping, looking at your career, but looking at the nonfiction things that you've written, not only 6 Inches Deeper and your books about the strange the Confederate Constitution, but you have articles that are written about farmers and their pig and the Depression and the decline of North Georgia working towns and things like that. What fascinates you about these stories, and how do you find them? You mentioned earlier that you pulled newspaper stories out and would save the clippings and I remember years ago in a journalism class, that's what Studs Terkel would do. And his office was piled with all of these newspaper and magazine clippings. And that years later, he would pull them out and write a great story about it. But he did it seemingly from this small kernel of a story that could have gone nowhere. How do you find these things, and how do you make these small, interesting kernels of a story come to life?
Well, what I should do is actually, if you can see my office behind me, I should have newspapers piled around, kind of for color, but actually, one of the things that fascinates me is the continuity of our lives. You live in Atlanta area. 88% of Georgians live in urban areas. Very few of us live in small towns. This is a small town. Washington County has 20,000 people, and at its peak more than a century ago, the maximum population was 30,000 people. It's a small town. My family's lived here for many, many generations. And it's hard to grow up where your family has lived for years and around people who know things and not hear stories. So I grew up hearing stories. You'd go to the barbershop back in the old days when they actually had barbershops and sit there, and the men would tell the story. Well, back in the Great Depression, and you would hear the story, and that fascinates me. And then again, there were family papers laying around the house, and you begin reading about something that your grandfather did 100 years ago or whatever. So what I found that history can be terribly fascinating if you can tease that story out of it. The way I do most of my research, I rely heavily on newspaper articles. Newspapers, particularly in the 19th century, before electronic communications, you could find almost anything you want in a small town newspaper. Wives would put notices in the paper that my husband drinks too much, and if you catch him, don't tell him not to come home. Catch him drunk, tell him not to come home. There's a tremendous number of newspaper sources, and then I just dig and ferret, and I go anywhere. I go to the Hargreaves Library in Athens to search. I get on, when appropriate, I'll go to the National Archives. I dig and dig and dig. I've got actually a talk I gave about doing research, and I have a picture of the Sparta Ishmaelite. Sparta, Georgia, in the latter part of the 19th century was the wealthiest town in the state of Georgia because of the cotton industry. And today it's a mere shadow of itself. And somewhere when I was doing research, stacked up in an old garage are newspapers going back 100 years that I had to wade through. You find little pearls, and one thing leads to another. So that's basically, and I'll get a storyline, and if I can fill it out, I'll tease it out, and then I'll write about it. I cannot hear you.
Oops, sorry about that, William. I was reading
Yep.
the questions from the chat and forgot to turn the microphone on. But we do have a few questions that have been in the chat room. So one of them you've already kind of answered about where you've done your research. But the other question was, how did the interviews help you tell the story?
You mean in this particular book? For example, I interviewed Lamar Cole, who was the prosecutor in the case. And Lamar is in his 80s now, but he's just sharp as a tack and a really fine person. You say, these are the facts. This is what I read in the court transcript. This is what you said here. What were you thinking when you said this? Tell me your feelings about things. And so, not that you say, not that I went in and said the prosecutor felt this or thought this, but it helps sort of bring clarity to a narrative. It helps you understand where things were going. And then you talk to other people, because anything that takes place, this particular episode took place in Valdosta, Georgia. Valdosta is in South Georgia, and it's as I was saying earlier, it's an oasis of urbanity and in a sea of rurality. And you got to know the town, you got to know the people. It's just fascinating to ride down the streets in Valdosta and just sit and take a deep breath and look at the live oaks and the palm trees and the pine trees down there, and you get a feel for the situation. So I believe in immersing myself in that.
Okay. And a follow-up to that from another person in the room, they're asking, how did you go about contacting the people that you interviewed for this book?
I have no fear. I'll call up anybody. And I called them up and say, listen, my name is William Rawlings. I'm writing a book. You don't know me, but I'm really a nice guy. Part of writing this book, there was a period of months that took me, that I think people had to sort of figure me out and check me out and find out that I really probably was not the devil incarnate. Once they got over that, they were very, very helpful. Most people, I had some good people in Valdosta who were willing to take the time to show me the ropes and sort of point me in the right direction. That was extremely helpful.
So another question in regards to this particular book is, how do we know, wondering if we know the motive of the murderer for this particular story?
If you read the book, it was alleged that the motive was sexual. There was, by the way, the term sexual harassment is not new. It was in use in the 1970s. I looked that up. I didn't realize it. I thought it was something, the 21st century term. But Keller had definitely been sexually harassing Ms. Hanks, despite the fact that he'd only been married 3 weeks before her murder. And in fact, that when as well as everyone can establish, when they were out burying the body, he and his new bride were supposedly at a reception honoring the new bride and the bridegroom. And so he was late for his own party because they were burying the woman that they had just killed, he and his father. Just digging, finding people, talking.
So now there's also a question about how you took to writing this book as well. And the question reads, when you wrote this book, do you start writing beginning to end, or start at the ending and write back toward the beginning?
I think everyone does things differently. I always write in a chronological manner. I always have. And if I'm writing fiction, I have this idea about how things are going to turn out. And the truth of the matter is, with fiction, they never do. As they say, the story writes itself. But in this particular case, it was pretty easy to get an outline or a timeline of what was happening. And then it was easier for me to simply approach it chronologically, because I knew what the issues were and I knew where I wanted to go, and I wanted to focus carefully on each segment. So I wrote, for example, when it comes to the trial, I would write each day carefully. Each day has a chapter, and what happened that day, the wins and losses for the prosecution, that kind of thing. And so I write chronologically. And then, of course, you end up going back and cleaning it up later, but that's usually how I write.
Excellent. We have two excellent questions from Theresa Weaver. Of course, I don't know why Theresa, being the great interviewer she is not asking these herself, but that's okay. So Theresa asks, was there any piece of information that you were not able to track down, or were there any mysteries left unsolved?
There were numerous pieces of information that I was not able to track down, and numerous hints and allegations and so forth and so on. But again, if you're writing nonfiction and you're trying to be truthful, you cannot make unsubstantiated allegations, particularly when they're individuals who are still alive, including the defendant who is alive and well. So anything that I said in the book is documented or documentable. I could have made it a lot more salacious, perhaps, but I didn't think that was appropriate. You'd ask about a motive. There was testimony. It's in the book. It was not used at trial, but Dr. Park Dietz. Park Dietz was a specialist in forensic psychiatry, I think, who wrote an opinion piece about the motivations of the killer. But it was not admissible in trial, and so it was there. I put it in, but it had nothing to do with the final outcome. There was lots of stuff, but it's just not appropriate to put in unless you can document it.
Okay. Now, do you yourself read a lot of true crime? Did you read a lot of true crime to maybe prepare to write this book? And if so, what are some of your favorites?
No, I rarely I read eclectically nonfiction. I rarely, I don't think I've ever read a true crime book. I may have, I don't know. I'm not sure that I have.
So, in conducting your interviews, and you said before we sort of went live with everyone, you've made several trips down to Valdosta, and we talked about the little remoteness of it. What was it like down there? When people heard that you were maybe beginning the interviewing process, that you were going to write a book to talk about this subject again. I'm from West Virginia, and I grew up in a small town that was down the road from where two still yet unsolved murders of some college co-eds took place. And I remember it colored a lot of the nighttime activities for a lot of people for as long as I can remember. And I've jokingly told people that I still don't drive down the road that the girls disappeared on at night. I don't do it. It's one of those things that you get a little bit of a cold chill, and then you just move along. But what was it like down there? Did people have a physical reaction to it? Did anyone give you any pushback about it?
Well, variable reactions, and you sort of walk into a place and you say, "Hi, you don't know me. I'm from a small town up the road, but I'm here to write about a murder that took place in Valdosta, 30 or 40 years ago." And people sort of look at you and raise their eyebrows. You have some people that are eager to talk. You have people that really want to talk to you, and you have others who sort of say, you're sort of invading our privacy. And you have others who absolutely refuse to talk, or they talk in circles. I had I've got copious notes of sitting down for many hours talking to people, making notes. And most of what I heard, I just simply could not use for reasons I said before. If you notice in the back of the book, I tried generally to thank people who have been helpful to me, and I normally list people who were good to me when I'm writing a book. But in this case, I just said there were a lot of people in Valdosta that told me a lot of things, and I think every single person who was willing to talk to me did not want their name used. So, and I didn't take any quotes. I didn't quote any of those people. Most of that was background information. One of the things that I mentioned before, and I'm sorry, I really should have mentioned this earlier, the Wilcoxes were extremely wealthy. They were the creme de la creme of Valdosta society, and the victim was a poor working lady. And as I describe in the book, the trial took place in the winter. The courtroom had two sides. One side was described as having mink and silk, and the other side was having cotton and denim. And that particular scene was repeated to me by a number of people who had attended the trial. It was a big dichotomy between the social standing of the convicted murderer and his father and the victim and her family. So yeah, it was a little strange, a little uncomfortable sometimes, but you do what you have to do.
So we have another question as well, and it's tied to a little bit of a compliment. So I'm just going to go ahead and read all of this. It's like, in all of your books, I have read them all. You have a fabulous way of just walking the reader into a book. How much time do you spend on the opening of a book, and how did you decide to open this story?
I spend, I always say the first 5 or 6 chapters of the book take as long. If the book has 30 chapters, I'll spend as much time on the first 5 or 6 chapters as I will on the last 25, because you have to set the scene. And in this particular book, I chose to set the scene talking about Valdosta, just about as the milieu in which the killing took place, in which the murder took place. And so, and the other thing is, the more you, without overriding, that's a great term, not being too descriptive, without overriding what you're doing, it really helps people to understand things if they get a little bit of description about things. If you know what Valdosta is like. So I described the city of Valdosta, its layout, why it was there, a little bit of its history and so forth. And I tried to tie that in as the book went ahead.
Well, I think you've mentioned in your chat here that you have a great office in the old historic Masonic lodge. So another question has come through about your writing process. Do you write every day? Talk us through that.
I think, again, I think it's similar to the previous question I answered. I think every writer is different. What I do, no matter what I'm writing, well, let's start with nonfiction. If I'm doing nonfiction, I read. I read incessantly for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I may take notes, and I try to learn the subject backwards and forwards, because if you don't know the subject, you simply cannot write about it. And most importantly, if you don't know the subject, you miss the little subtleties and the little things that make it fascinating. With fiction, I tend to spend a long time thinking about the plot, where the plot is going, and I may or may not make notes. I usually will end up writing about a one-page synopsis of it, and then when I'm finally finished with it, I realize the one-page synopsis was totally wrong. It's not what I wrote, it's what I thought it would be when I started. Then when the writing process, I sit down and I say, okay, if it's fiction, I'm going to write X number of chapters this week. Nonfiction, I set myself a goal and I say, I'm going to do this. If I will write very intensely for a week or two, and then I may do read, and then I'll write very intensely for a week or two. It just depends on what I'm doing. But I tend to either read or do research or think about what I'm writing or write. And I don't do both at the same time.
Do you get very caught up in the stories? And if you do get caught up in the stories, how do you then step back from it?
Well, I think you get caught up in a story like this because you get to know the family of the people involved, and you can't help but feel some empathy for those situations. When I'm writing fiction, though, I do get caught up in the story, and I'll wake up in the middle of the night. You'll get to some point in your book or the plot where you're writing, you don't know where you've written yourself in a corner, you don't know how you're going to get out of the situation, and then all of a sudden I'll wake up in the middle of the night having had a dream. I'll say, oh, that's what happened, and I write it down and I solve the problem. It requires a lot of obsessiveness. My wife says I'm a little OCD. Perhaps I am.
Cool. And of course, someone has also asked if you could maybe give us a little bit of a teaser about the book on lighthouses that you're working on.
I'd be glad to. This was Mercy University Press asked me to do this, and we were casting about what to do when I finished this book. And lighthouses are fascinating. And again, back to that phrase, jumping genre, we're doing it again. This it's a combination of interesting things and history. Georgia has 5 existing lighthouses on the coast. There's Cockspur and Tybee Light in Savannah. There's Sapelo Light on Sapelo Island. There's St. Simon's Light, and there is Little Cumberland Light. I think that's all 5. And this book is going to be a larger format. I won't say it'll be a full-fledged coffee table book, but it'll be a larger format, heavily illustrated book. A lot of photography I did myself. The first half of it talks about lighthouses in general. What is a lighthouse? How's a lighthouse built? Why is it important? And then the last 5, and also have chapters on, for example, lighthouses during the Confederacy. During the Civil War, there was a Confederate Lighthouse Bureau, believe it or not. About lighthouse keepers, about the mystique of lighthouses. The last half of the book, which is 5 chapters, each one is devoted to each of the individual lighthouses. And so it's a fun book, actually. It's turned out to be pretty well. I've basically finished the manuscript. I'll turn it in next month.
Oh, excellent. So we have 2 advice questions that have come up in the chat rooms. And one of the questions is, what advice would you give aspiring writers? And also, what advice would you have for someone who is thinking about changing genre?
I guess I'll answer, but advice to both of those is that it has to be fun. If it's not fun, you shouldn't do it. I mean, writing, I sometimes say I dislike the process. I love the product, but I dislike the process. The process can be arduous. But at the same time, I get a lot of pleasure out of writing. I enjoy being creative and doing something like that. I think for an aspiring writer, my best advice would be the Nike motto, just do it. You have to sit down and force yourself to do it. And sometimes you have to force yourself to write 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 chapters, and then you get some feedback, and it's inevitably negative. You get some more feedback, and eventually you'll get where you want to go. I guess that covers both of it.
So, did you ever think during the process of writing this particular book that maybe either through the interviews or maybe how you discovered things that did you ever think about writing this as a fiction book, taking the whole nonfiction element out of it, sort of like releasing yourself from the constraints of because you have people who are still alive, that you didn't want to breach confidentiality, you didn't want to be accusatory of taking it in a fiction manner rather than proceeding and doing it in a very journalistic nonfiction manner?
Well, if I wanted to write, I'm pretty strict about the dichotomy between fiction and nonfiction. You have people that talk about creative nonfiction or whatever. I'm one of these people that says you have fiction on one side if it's not true, if all of it's not true, and you have nonfiction which is true. I believe in that sharp dichotomy. And in this particular case, no, I wouldn't have fictionalized it. I wouldn't have put words in the mouth of either the victim or the perpetrators of this. I just don't think that's appropriate. Every now and then I'll read a book where someone puts words in the mouth of some military general, for example, what he was thinking during some battle or something like that. I think they don't know that. They really don't know that. And so I'm either you do fiction or you do nonfiction, and kind of there's nowhere in between. And when I do fiction, in this case, because so many people are still alive, and I'm sure people would be offended if they thought that I said that I libeled them. So I'm very, very, very carefully documented what I said. And I had several attorneys read it just to be sure.
Always good to have that covered for your manuscript, just in case.
Right, just in case, yeah.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any other questions for William while we're still in the room? Let us know either in the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to just go and ask them directly. So while we're waiting, I do want to go ahead and let everyone know Eagle Eye Bookshop is, of course, the store that we have this evening that has copies of 6 Inches Deeper in stock. You can either give them a call. They are doing curbside pickup. They are doing mail to home if you would like to do that. Allie, I believe, has put the order link if you just want to order directly online from them in the chat. It's also on the Facebook page for this particular event. Once again, thank you all for supporting our independent bookstores. They have really been going above and beyond during this pandemic to get books mailed to people's homes, to do curbside pickup, to make great recommendations, and just basically helping to keep independent bookstores alive. If you're not in the area, I would suggest finding the independent bookstore in your area and definitely calling them and ordering directly from them as well. Especially at this time too, our Black-owned independent bookstores like Brave and Kind, Madu. Reach out to those folks and really order from them. It's our independent bookstores, now that so many of our libraries are closed, that are really reaching out and being community advocates for our authors. So I thank you in advance for doing that as well. Well, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. William, is there anything else that you would like to tell us about this book, or maybe even what you're working on past the Lighthouse book before we sign off this evening?
Well, no, I don't think so. I simply want to thank everyone for attending. I am working actively on the book for, at least the Lighthouse book is next year, 2021. So I am actively working on a book for 2022, but I haven't really, I'm not ready to announce that yet. I probably will be within the next month, but I'll have something coming. That'll be book number 12 if I don't get burned out between now and then.
Excellent. Well, you have some very lovely fans in the chat room. They're encouraging you to keep on writing.
Well,
so,
thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, William. It's been a wonderful evening. It was great to hear about this story and once again see all the interesting little facets that South Georgia seems to have in it in such a wonderful way that you brought this to our attention. Thank you all for attending. If you missed this, or if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, we will have the link posted tomorrow. So thank you once again, and we will see you all in another one of our chats very soon.